You know that feeling when you have been away from home for a long time, and all you can think about is your own bed and the smell of your own house? I had been dreaming about that moment for 2 weeks straight. I was sitting in the back of a medical transport van, gripping the armrest because every single bump in the road sent a jolt of electricity shooting through my freshly operated on hip. I am 68 years old, and let me tell you, hip replacement surgery is no walk in the park. It is brutal. But the one thing getting me through the hospital food and the sleepless nights was the thought of my garden. Specifically my rose garden. I have spent 40 years cultivating that garden. It was my sanctuary. It wasn't just a bunch of flowers thrown into the dirt. It was a living timeline of my life. There was the yellow peace rose my late husband, Henry, planted on our first anniversary. There were the crimson Mr. Lincolns I put in the ground the day my daughter was born because she had these bright red cheeks. There was a massive trellis of climbing pink Eden roses that took me a decade to train properly so they would arch over the walkway like a fairy tale entrance. People in our town actually stopped their cars to take pictures of my side yard. It was my pride and joy. It was the only thing Henry left me that was still alive, something I could touch and care for. So, as the van turned the corner onto Maple Street, I cranked the window down. I wanted to smell them. It was late May, prime blooming season. I was expecting that heavy, sweet perfume of 400 blooming roses to hit me in the face and make me forget about the throbbing pain in my leg. But I didn't smell roses. I smelled diesel fumes. I smelled wet dirt. And I smelled something sharp like fresh-cut pine and sawdust. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a different kind of pain than the one in my hip. I leaned forward, ignoring the doctor's orders to keep my back straight, and squinted through the windshield. As we pulled up to my driveway, my brain literally could not process what my eyes were seeing. It was like looking at a photograph of a war zone. Where my trellis used to be, there was nothing but air. The lush green wall that separated my property from the house next door was gone. The ground was stripped bare. It wasn't just that the bushes were trimmed, they were eradicated. The earth had been churned up by heavy machinery. There were deep tire tracks gouged into the mud where my prize-winning hybrids used to stand. A bright orange excavator was parked right in the middle of where my bird bath had been for 30 years. I felt like I was going to throw up. I honestly thought I was having a nightmare or a hallucination from the pain medication. I tried to open the van door before the driver even put it in park. Hey, before I tell you what I screamed at the man standing in the middle of my destroyed life, I want to ask you something. I always wonder who is listening to these stories. Pause the video for 2 seconds and drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now and what city you are watching from. I read every single one. Back to the disaster. The driver, a nice young man named Kevin, rushed around to help me out. He had to practically lift me because my knees were shaking so bad, and it wasn't from the surgery. It was pure, unadulterated rage. Mrs. Eleanor, careful now, Kevin said, looking at the yard with wide eyes. Did you hire landscapers? No, I whispered, my voice cracking. I didn't. I hobbled up the driveway on my walker, every step an agonizing mix of physical struggle and emotional heartbreak. That is when I saw him. Greg Miller. The new neighbor. He and his wife Linda had moved into the house next door about 6 months ago. They were young, maybe early 30s, flashy and loud. They drove cars that cost more than my house and never returned a wave. Greg was standing there in a tight t-shirt and expensive sunglasses, holding a blueprint, pointing at something on the ground. He looked up as I approached, and he didn't look guilty. He didn't look horrified. He looked annoyed. Like I was interrupting his workday. What have you done? I screamed. It came out as a shriek. Where are my roses? Where is my garden? Greg took a sip of his iced coffee and walked over to the property line, or where the property line used to be defined by my beautiful bushes. Oh, hey Eleanor, he said, totally casual. You're back. We saw the ambulance take you away a few weeks ago. Linda said you probably wouldn't be coming back to a big place like this. Thought you were heading to a facility or something. I froze. A facility? I went in for hip surgery, you idiot. I am not invalid. What did you do to my yard? He shrugged, gesturing to the muddy wasteland behind him. Look, we're putting in a heated saltwater pool. Needed the clearance for the deck and the filtration system. Plus, those bushes of yours were overgrown and spilling onto our side. They were an eyesore and attracting bees. We did you a favor, really. Cleared it all out so you don't have to worry about maintenance anymore. You're welcome. I stared at him. I looked at the hole where Henry's anniversary rose used to be. It was just a pit of mud now. 40 years of love, ripped out by a machine because this man wanted a pool deck. You destroyed my property, I said, my voice dropping to a low, shaking growl. You crossed the property line. Actually, Greg smirked, pulling a folded paper from his back pocket. We had a surveyor come out while you were gone. Turns out your little garden has been encroaching on our lot by about 4 feet for decades. We just reclaimed what's ours. We're pouring the concrete foundation tomorrow, so if you could keep the noise down, that would be great. Linda has a migraine. He turned his back on me. He actually turned his back on me and walked away while I stood there, leaning on my walker, crying over a pile of dirt that used to be my life's work. But as I looked at that orange excavator, something inside me shifted. He thought I was just some feeble old lady who would cry and go inside to eat applesauce. He had no idea who he had just declared war on. After that horrific encounter in the driveway, Kevin the driver helped me into my house. He was so gentle, practically carrying me up the front steps while I sobbed into a tissue. Once he made sure I was settled in my recliner with a glass of water and my pain meds, he left, but not before giving me a look of pure pity. I hate pity. I have never needed pity a day in my life. I am the woman who reshingled her own garden shed at 60. I am the woman who nursed a husband through 3 years of cancer without hiring a nurse. But sitting there in my quiet living room staring out the side window at the devastation next door, I felt small. I felt exactly how Greg wanted me to feel. Expired. To understand why that hole in the ground felt like a physical amputation, you have to understand the history. You can't just buy a garden like that at a store. You can't Amazon Prime 40 years of soil chemistry. When Henry and I bought this house back in the early 80s, the soil was basically concrete. It was hard-packed red clay that wouldn't grow a weed, let alone a rose. We didn't have money for landscapers or fancy imported topsoil. We did it the hard way. For 5 years, every single weekend Henry and I were out there with pickaxes. We tilled that earth until our hands were permanently stained brown. We drove pickup trucks full of manure from local farms. We composted every apple core and eggshell we ever ate. I remember the day we planted that first peace rose. It was pouring rain. Henry was slipping in the mud, laughing his head off, trying to dig the hole while I held the umbrella over the tiny, fragile root ball. He looked at me, hair plastered to his forehead, and said, "Al, we're planting this deep. This one isn't going anywhere. It's going to outlast us both." And he was right. It did outlast him. When Henry died 10 years ago, I fell into a dark place. The house felt too big, too quiet. The silence was deafening. The only thing that got me out of bed was that garden. The roses needed pruning. They needed deadheading. They needed water. They demanded I stay alive to take care of them. That wall of green and color was my barrier against the world, my private chapel where I could talk to Henry without feeling crazy. Then came the Millers. The house next door had belonged to the Robinsons for 30 years. They were lovely people who used to pass tomatoes over the fence. When they moved to Arizona, I was nervous about who would buy it, but I tried to keep an open mind. Then the moving truck showed up and out stepped Greg and Linda. The red flag started waving literally on day one. I did the neighborly thing. I baked my famous oatmeal scotchies, "Don't knock 'em until you try 'em," and walked over to welcome them. I was using a cane then, just for balance, not the walker. I knocked on the door and Linda answered. She didn't smile. She didn't open the door wide. She just stood there, blocking the entrance like a bouncer at a club, holding a tiny dog that looked like a rat on a caffeine high. "Hi," she said flatly. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I beamed, holding out the plate. "I'm Eleanor from next door. I made you some cookies." She looked at the plate like I was offering her a petri dish of bacteria. "Oh, thanks. We don't really do gluten or sugar. But, thanks." He took the plate with 2 fingers like it was radioactive. "Hey, while you're here, does your gardener come on Tuesdays? Because his leaf blower woke me up last week." "I am the gardener," I said a little stiffly. "And I don't use a leaf blower. I rake." "Right. Well, whatever. The birds in your bushes are really loud in the morning. Is there anything you can do about that?" I blinked. "You want me to silence the birds?" "It's just super annoying," she sighed, closing the door. "We'll return the plate." They never returned the plate. Over the next 6 months, it was a constant battle of passive aggression. They installed motion sensor floodlights that shined directly into my bedroom window at night. When I asked them to angle them down, Greg told me to buy blackout curtains. They threw their trash bags on the curb a day early so the raccoons would scatter garbage all over my lawn, and when I complained, Linda said the wind must have blown it from my side. But the worst was the conversation about the pool. About 2 months before my surgery, Greg leaned over the fence while I was pruning the Eden roses. "Hey Elle," he called out. He always called me Elle, even though I asked him to call me Eleanor. "We're thinking of putting in a pool. Gonna need to tear down this fence. You mind if we trim these bushes back? They're gonna be in the way of the deck." "I absolutely do mind," I said, putting down my shears. "These roses are very old. You cannot trim them back, they are the border. And this is a shared fence. You need my permission to remove it." Right, permission," he laughed, waving his hand dismissively. "We'll figure it out. Don't worry your little head about it." I thought that was the end of it. I said no. No is a complete sentence. I didn't realize that to people like Greg and Linda, no is just a suggestion from a person they don't respect. They saw a lonely old woman with a bad hip and thought I was just a temporary inconvenience like a speed bump. So when the ambulance took me away that morning 2 weeks ago, screaming in pain from my hip joint finally giving out, they didn't see a neighbor in distress. They saw an opportunity. They saw an empty house and a clear timeline. They waited until I was sedated in a hospital bed, defenseless, to execute their plan. They didn't just trim the bushes, they erased them. And now, sitting in my chair, staring at the muddy scar on the earth, I realized the facility comment wasn't a joke. They were banking on me never coming back. The next morning I woke up to a sound that vibrated my fillings. Hisses. Thud. It was 7 in the morning. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Henry's roses being fed into a wood chipper. I dragged myself out of the recliner. Sleeping in a bed was impossible with the hip, and maneuvered my walker to the window. A massive cement mixer was backing into Greg's driveway. Its backup beeper was piercing the quiet morning air like a relentless alarm clock from hell. Beep, beep, beep. They weren't wasting any time. Greg had said they were pouring the foundation today and he meant it. I watched as a crew of guys in neon vests started running chutes from the truck toward the giant hole in the backyard. They were shouting over the engine noise, laughing, drinking coffee. It was just another Tuesday for them. For me it was the final nail in the coffin. Once that concrete was poured, it was permanent. You can replant a bush maybe, but you can't unpour 10 tons of concrete without a jackhammer and a lawsuit. I grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hit the buttons. I called the city zoning office. "City planning, this is Brenda." "Brenda, this is Eleanor Vance on Maple Street," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My neighbor is pouring a pool foundation right now. I need to know if they have a permit." I heard typing. Address. 412 Maple Street. One moment. Checking. Yes, Mrs. Vance. Permit number 49201. Approved last week. In-ground pool and patio deck. My stomach dropped. But they destroyed my property to do it. They tore out my garden. They said I was encroaching on their land. "Well, ma'am," Brenda sighed, sounding like she'd had this conversation 1,000 times. "If there's a property line dispute, that's a civil matter. We just approved the construction based on the surveyor's report they submitted. If they have a stamped survey saying the land is theirs, we issue the permit. You'd have to take it up with a lawyer." I hung up. A lawyer. I'm on a fixed income. I have a pension and Social Security. I don't have a sue your neighbor for property damage fund. I watched helplessly as the gray sludge started flowing down the chute, filling the wooden forms they had built right over the grave of my Mr. Lincoln roses. I couldn't just watch. I had to try one more time. I put on my robe, grabbed my walker and went out the back door. The noise was deafening. Greg was standing by the mixer talking to the foreman. He saw me coming and rolled his eyes so hard I saw the whites from 50 feet away. He said something to the foreman, they both laughed, and then he walked over to the property line. "Eleanor. Back for more," he shouted over the truck. "You should be resting. That hip needs to heal." "Stop the truck, Greg," I yelled, pointing my finger at him. "You cannot pour that concrete. I know my property lines. Henry and I measured this lot ourselves 40 years ago." "Yeah, well, Henry used a tape measure from the hardware store," Greg shouted back, stepping closer, looming over the invisible line. "We used a laser surveyor licensed by the state. You were 4 feet over, Grandma. Deal with it. The concrete is flowing. It's done." It is not done. I cried, tears hot on my cheeks. You are stealing my land. You're senile, he snapped, his nice guy mask finally slipping completely. You're a lonely, bitter old woman who cares more about some dead bushes than your neighbors trying to improve the property value. Nobody cares about your stupid roses, Eleanor. Look around. It's progress. Now get back inside before you break your other hip and I have to call the ambulance again. That hit me like a physical slap. He was gaslighting me. He was using my age and my injury against me, painting me as the crazy old lady so he could steal 4 feet of prime real estate. I looked at the wet concrete spreading across the dirt. It was halfway full. I turned around. I didn't say another word. I couldn't. I was defeated. I shuffled back into my house, closing the door on his smug face and the roar of the mixer. I sat at my kitchen table, the vibration of the construction rattling my teacup in its saucer. I felt completely hopeless. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just an old relic holding on to the past. Maybe I had measured wrong all those years ago. But then I remembered something. I remembered the day we bought the house. I remembered the closing meeting. It was in a stuffy office downtown with a lawyer who smoked cigars. There was a huge stack of paperwork. And I remembered Henry arguing about something. He was arguing about a utility line. He was worried about where we could plant trees. We have to be careful, Elle, he had said, pointing to a map. There's an old easement here. We can't build anything permanent on this strip. No sheds, no garages. But roses are okay? I had asked. Roses are fine, he smiled. Just no concrete. Just no concrete. My heart skipped a beat. If there was an easement, a legal restriction on the land use, it wouldn't matter where the property line was. Easements are powerful. They are permanent. And they are usually buried very, very deep in the paperwork. I looked at the clock. It was 10 a.m. The concrete was still wet. I needed those papers. But where were they? Henry kept everything. He was a hoarder of documents. You never know when you'll need to prove you own the air you breathe, he used to say. I looked up at the attic hatch in the hallway ceiling. The papers were in the old cedar chest. In the attic. I looked at my walker. I looked at my hip. The doctor said no stairs. Absolutely no stairs for 6 weeks. I took a deep breath. I grabbed the banister. Sorry, doctor, I whispered to the empty house. But this is an emergency. The stairs were a mountain. And I was climbing Everest without oxygen. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and pain. I had to hook my bad leg up, drag the good one, grip the railing until my knuckles turned white and heave. 1 step. Breathe. Sweat. 2 steps. Breathe. Curse Greg Miller. 3 steps. By the time I reached the top of the landing, I was drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. But I wasn't done. I had to pull down the attic hatch. I used the handle of my cane to hook the ring and pulled. The ladder slid down with a dusty creak. I stared at it. It wasn't a staircase. It was a flimsy wooden skeleton. If I fell, nobody would find me for days. Kevin the driver wasn't coming back. My daughter lived 3 states away. I was alone. Do it for Henry, a voice inside my head said. Do it for the peace, Rose. I crawled. I literally crawled up that ladder on my hands and knees, dragging my operated leg behind me like dead weight. When I rolled onto the dusty attic floorboards, I lay there for 5 minutes just catching my breath, inhaling the smell of mothballs and old paper. The cedar chest was in the corner, buried under Christmas decorations from 1995. I shoved aside a plastic Santa and clawed at the lid. It creaked open. Inside was a chaotic timeline of our life. Tax returns from the 80s, warranties for appliances we threw out 20 years ago, and right at the bottom, a thick yellowing envelope labeled, House Deed and Survey 1982. I ripped it open. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly tore the paper. I rifled through the standard deed, the mortgage papers, and then I found it. A blue-tinted document folded into a tiny square. Municipal Utility Easement Agreement, 1924. My eyes scanned the faded typewriter text. It was dense legalese full of heretofores and aforementions. I squinted in the dim light. Granting the city and county access to the subterranean sewage and storm drain conduit running parallel to the northern boundary, spanning a width of 10 feet from the central line. I scrambled to find the map attached to the back. There it was. A dotted line running right through the side yard. Right through where my garden used to be. And right through where Greg was currently pouring concrete. And then the sentence that was pure gold. The sentence that was going to serve as my sword and shield. Strictly prohibiting the erection of any permanent structures, foundations, or impermeable surfaces, including but not limited to masonry, concrete, or swimming pools, over said easement area to ensure municipal access for repairs. I gasped. It wasn't about the property line. It didn't matter if Greg owned the land or if I did. The city owned the rights to the ground underneath it. And you cannot pour a concrete pool on top of a city sewer main. I looked at the date. 1924. This was a 100-year-old piece of paper. A century-old shield waiting for this exact moment. I stuffed the paper into my robe pocket and made the perilous descent. Going down was worse than going up. I slid down on my butt one rung at a time, gritting my teeth so hard I thought they would crack. When I hit the floor, I didn't stop. I went straight to the kitchen table, grabbed my phone, and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Harold. It's Eleanor Vance. Harold was Henry's old college buddy. He was also a retired real estate attorney who still kept his license active, just to annoy people, as he liked to say. Eleanor. I heard about the hip. How are you holding up? Harold, I need you to file an emergency injunction. Today. Within the hour. I explained everything. The roses. The concrete. The easement. Harold listened, humming every now and then. When I finished reading him the clause from the 1924 document, he let out a low whistle. Eleanor, my dear, he chuckled, and I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. That is not just a smoking gun. That is a nuclear warhead. If that easement is still active, and utility easements almost always are, they are legally trespassing on city infrastructure. I can get a judge to sign a stop work order before their lunch break. Do it, I said. And Harold? They already poured the foundation. Ooh, Harold said. That's unfortunate for them. That's very, very unfortunate. I'll call the courthouse. You go pour yourself a drink. I'll handle the rest. I hung up and slumped into my chair. I was exhausted. My hip was throbbing with a vengeance. But as I looked out the window at the cement mixer driving away, leaving a massive slab of wet gray concrete curing in the sun, I didn't feel helpless anymore. I felt dangerous. I watched Greg walking around the perimeter of his new pool foundation, high-fiving the foreman. He looked so proud. He looked like a king surveying his kingdom. He had no idea that I was holding the ace of spades. He had no idea that this senile old woman had just launched a missile from her kitchen table. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat by the window. And I waited. Took 3 hours. 3 glorious, suspense-filled hours. I sat in my window like a sniper, tea in hand, watching the concrete dry. Greg and Linda were out on their patio drinking wine, pointing at the slab, probably discussing where to put the tiki bar. Then a black sedan pulled up. Not a construction truck. A sedan with the county seal on the door. A man in a suit got out, followed by a sheriff's deputy. They walked up Greg's driveway. Greg stood up, looking confused but still arrogant. He probably thought they were there to give him an award for Best New Pool. I cracked my window open just a sliver. I needed to hear this. Mr. Gregory Miller? The man in the suit asked. Yeah. Who are you? I'm from the city attorney's office. This is Deputy Miller. No relation, I assume. We have a court order to cease all construction immediately. Whoa, 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 Greg laughed, stepping forward. You're a little late, buddy. The foundation is poured. Permit is approved. Talk to Brenda at zoning. We spoke to zoning, the attorney said, his voice ice cold. And we also spoke to Judge Henderson. It appears you failed to disclose a registered municipal utility easement on your survey application. You have poured a permanent concrete structure directly over the main storm drain for this sector. Greg's face went pale. Easement? What easement? The surveyor didn't see any easement. It's on the master deed, Mr. Miller. Ignorance of the deed is not a legal defense. You are in violation of City Code 84.2. You are blocking access to critical infrastructure. So, what? Greg stammered, looking at the drying concrete. I have to pay a fine? The attorney handed him a thick stack of papers. No, sir. The court order mandates the immediate removal of the obstruction. Removal? Greg shrieked. It's wet concrete. It's 10 tons. You want me to remove it? By Friday, the attorney said calmly. At your expense. If it's not gone, the city will bring in our own crews to remove it, and we will bill you triple the cost. Additionally, you are liable for the restoration of the easement area to its original condition. Original condition? Linda piped up, looking horrified. That means soil grading and vegetation, the attorney said, glancing at his notes. According to the plaintiff, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the area was previously occupied by a mature rose garden. You will be required to fund the replanting of equivalent flora. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Equivalent flora. Do you know how much a 40-year-old rose bush costs to replace? You can't just buy them at Home Depot. You have to hire specialists. You have to import mature plants. Costs thousands. Greg looked over at my house. He saw me in the window. Our eyes locked. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just took a sip of my tea. The next few weeks were a symphony of justice. The jackhammers arrived on Thursday. It was louder than the cement mixer, but to me it sounded like Mozart. I watched as they broke apart the pool Greg had been so proud of. Chunk by chunk they hauled it away. The dust covered their fancy cars. The noise drove Linda to stay at her mother's house. But the best part came later. The court mediation. Harold was brilliant. He argued that simply planting new seeds wasn't restoration. He brought in a horticultural appraiser who valued my destroyed garden at over $50,000 due to the age and rarity of the specimens. Greg and Linda had to pay. They had to pay for the demolition. They had to pay the city fines. And they had to write a check to a high-end landscape architecture firm to rebuild my garden exactly as it was. Took 6 months. I watched from my porch as a team of professional gardeners, real ones, not Greg with a shovel, installed a new trellis. They brought in mature climbing roses that had been grown in nurseries for years. They amended the soil. They installed an irrigation system so I wouldn't have to carry the hose anymore. Greg and Linda moved out 3 months later. I heard the financial hit from the pool disaster and the lawsuit was too much for them, plus they couldn't stand living next to the crazy old lady who beat them. The new neighbors are a young couple with a baby. They asked me last week if I could teach them how to grow tomatoes. My hip is better now. I can walk without the cane. Yesterday I went out to the garden. The new peace rose is blooming. It's not the same one Henry planted, but it's beautiful. It smells like victory. I sat on my bench listening to the bees buzzing in the flowers, and I looked at the spot where the pool almost was. It's green again. It's alive. So here's the lesson, kids. Never underestimate an old lady with a library card and a grudge. And never ever mess with a gardener's roses. We know where to dig the holes. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice served cold.